Hello, everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of Snugglepot and Cuddlepie by May Gibbs. Illustrations also done by May Gibbs. When last we left off, we were travelling through an underwater world full of marvels and mysteries, with Ragged Blossom and Snugglepot, who had found the little baby Abelia, who is destined to be princess of the fish folk. We'll hear more about Abelia in the next story. Meanwhile, though, Cuddlepie has been off doing his own thing. If you recall, our poor friend Cuddlepie was trying to make some money to help the group continue on their journey, and he had painted some little pictures and laid out his cap for donations, but no one had given him anything, and in fact his clothes were stolen, so that he was cold and hungry and alone. He was met by an old nut who told him that he could help, and was taken into this man's home. It is there that we will pick up the story of Cuddlepie. So, let's get started. All right, my friends. Here we are again, back at the book. My childhood copy of Snugglepot and Cuddlepie. Ready to continue our story from the next page. When the kind nut carried Cuddlepie into his house, who do you think was sitting in his easy chair, comfortably reading a book and smoking his pipe? Why, dear old Mr. Lizard, as large as life. So utterly astonished was Mr. Lizard that he sprang high up out of his chair and knocked a hole in the ceiling. Cuddlepie ran to him with a shout of joy and hugged him. Kind Mr. Nut looked on in surprise. "I'd better get something to eat and drink," he said, and hurried out of the room. Then Cuddlepie and Mr. Lizard had a long talk, and when Cuddlepie had told his story, Mr. Lizard looked very solemn indeed. "And where are Snugglepot and Ragged Blossom now?" he asked. "I don't know," said Cuddlepie. "I've lost them." "Then," said Mr. Lizard, springing up again and making another hole in the ceiling, "I must be off at once, this minute. Great snakes, my bully ant, oh gum!" And with that he dashed out of the door and was gone. At this moment Mr. Nut came in, carrying a tray of good things to eat. "Stop!" he shouted to Mr. Lizard. "Wait! I've got some lovely cakes." And in his anxiety to stop Mr. Lizard, he jumped on his disappearing tail. Whoosh went the tail, and over went Mr. Nut, and down went the tray full of goodies. "Pert, pert," said Mr. Nut, getting up and rubbing himself. "What a pity. Such nice ones. All dirty. I'll have to cook all day tomorrow now." "Could I help you?" asked Cuddlepie. "Yes, yes," said the kind nut. "Good idea. Now, we'll go to bed, and don't you worry, little chap. In the morning, Mr. Lizard will come back with news of your friends. He's a mighty clever chap, is Old Man Lizard." So they went to bed, and Cuddlepie was so tired that he slept soundly till the sun was high in the blue, and all the city was up and dressed long since. Cuddlepie found Mr. Nut in the kitchen, hard at work, making cakes. "I'm sorry I'm late," said Cuddlepie. "Please let me help." "Dear, dear, of course," said Mr. Nut, and he gave Cuddlepie some pollen and dew to mix. It was such fun making cakes that Cuddlepie forgot all his troubles and was quite happy. And here we can see Cuddlepie helping Mr. Nut to mix cakes with a little helpful beetle, sweeping away all of this debris on the floor. Mr. Nut has a dirty home. And a bee or some other kind of insect who must be smelling the delicious smells from the cooking cakes. There's no fire, though. But this explains it. Now, nuts do all their cooking with the heat of the sun, so they have to cook enough cakes and things to last over the days when there isn't any sun. Mr. Nut was a baker. Cuddlepie was so useful all the morning that Mr. Nut said he could live with him and drive his cart round if he liked. Cuddlepie was delighted, and Mrs. Prying Mantis, who was peeping in at the sun-hole, went away and told all the neighbours that Mr. Nut had a new baker man, and how nice-looking he was, and all the clever things he could do. The news went round till it came to the big, soft ears of Mrs. Bear. Now, Mrs. Bear was big and fat and rich, and she was one of those people who liked doing things other people didn't do, so that all her neighbours would say, "How clever," and "How strange." So she thought, "I'll give a big party and ask this baker boy to come and do all his tricks, and it will be the talk of the place." Next day, a large invitation card came. "Miss Koala wants Mr. Nut's baker boy to do tricks at her party." "Odds pods!" exclaimed Mr. Nut. "That's a grand invitation. You must go, of course. Dear, dear, put, put." Now, Cuddlepie didn't know any tricks at all, but he wanted to go to the party. So he thought and thought all day and all night. He lay awake, thinking how he could do some clever trick at the party. And as he lay there, the frogs were singing and croaking out in the night. And while he listened to them, a wonderful idea came to him. He jumped out of bed and went down to the swamps and had a long talk with the frogs. And then he went home to bed again, and as he fell asleep, a happy smile settled on his face. On the morning of the party, a large cart drove up to the door of Mrs. Bear's house. "Mr. Cuddlepie, the baker boy, sends his best wishes, And will Mrs. Bear allow his pianola to be put into her parlour, so that he can play to her tonight?" said the serve ant. Clever. Mrs. Bear was most delighted, and the workman struggled in with a great tree trunk, so large that it took 10 workers and 25 serve ants to carry it. Fortunately, Mrs. Bear's house was very, very large, or the pianola wouldn't have gone through the doorway. News went around the neighbourhood that something wonderful was going to happen at Mrs. Bear's party. So all the people who were asked dressed early and went off in great excitement. And so great was the crowd that a lot of people who were not invited slipped in without being noticed. When Cuddlepie arrived, very late, everybody pressed close to look at him, and all the important visitors shook hands with him. Then Mrs. Bear said, "Will you play us something on your wonderful pianola, Mr. Cuddlepie?" And Cuddlepie, looking very grand and grown up, bowed and said, "That's what I'd like to do, Mrs. Bear." And here we can see everyone at the party getting ready for Cuddlepie's performance. We've got Mr. and Mrs. Kookaburra and Mrs. Bear and a possum in a big chair, and all the nuts and blossoms gathered around. Then he sat on a stool by the tree trunk and put his feet upon the bark petals and worked them up and down as hard as he could, and there came forth a most wonderful noise, for the tree trunk was hollow, and there were 100 frogs hidden in it, and the largest one had his eye to a hole to see when it was time to begin and when to stop. The harder Cuddlepie worked the pedals, the louder the frogs sang. When Cuddlepie stopped, they stopped, because Mr. Frog at the peephole gave the signal. Everyone was amazed, delighted. They had never heard such a beautiful noise. "So loud," said Mrs. Kookaburra. "So like a creek," said Mrs. Bear. "Just like moonbeams," said another. "So beautiful to talk to," said Mrs. Parrot. Every time Cuddlepie played his pianola, Mrs. Parrot talked louder and louder. "You know, my dear," she was saying to Mr. Owl, "when my friend Mr. Eagle saw the Banksia man throw the bag into the sea, he swooped down and caught it. But as he did so, out fell a blossom and a nut. Wasn't it?" "What?" screamed Cuddlepie, who had heard all she said. The music died away, and everyone gasped as Cuddlepie sprang upon Mrs. Parrot and seized her wing. Tell me, he cried. "What did Mr. Eagle see? Were they drowned? Oh, tell me." "I don't know. I really don't know," stammered Mrs. Parrot. "I can tell you," said Mr. Possum. "I know the story. They fell into the mouth of a big fish and were swallowed." "That's all wrong," chuckled Mrs. Kookaburra. "Quite wrong. I had the story from Mr. Shag, who was an eyewitness. He saw them sink and dived in after them. They went straight to the bottom and were drowned." At these words, Cuddlepie became very pale and cried, "Who will go with me and show me where they fell into the sea?" When Cuddlepie said this, everyone jumped up and everyone wanted to go, but nobody knew where to go, and everyone talked at once, and all the frogs hopped out of the pianola, but no one noticed them. "Come with me," said a voice close to Cuddlepie's ear. "I can help you." And turning, he saw Mrs. Kookaburra. "Are they friends of yours?" she asked, as they hastened out of the house.
"Yes,"
said Cuddlepie, his tears falling.
"my brother Snugglepot and my friend Ragged Blossom."
"Goodness me," said Mrs. Kookaburra. "How dreadful! Now, if you'll ride on my back, I'll take you to see my friend Mr. Shag. He knows Mr. Eagle, and between them we shall surely learn something." Cuddlepie climbed onto Mrs. Kookaburra's broad back, and away she flew. They very soon reached the sea, and Mrs. Kookaburra flew slowly along the coast, looking for her friend. "He may be anywhere," she explained. "He loves travelling." Once they passed a seaside place where lots of nuts and blossoms were surfing. They all looked so happy, and poor Cuddlepie felt so miserable that his tears kept dropping as they went, and the people looked up to see if it was raining. "Ooh, and there we can see all of the nuts and blossoms enjoying the waves." For Australia, where this takes place, has excellent beaches. For many days they flew up and down the coast, till at last, one day, they heard a shout, and looking down they saw, far away below them, standing on the branch of a dead tree waving to them. Who do you think? Why, old Mr. Shag himself. So Mrs. Kookaburra flew down, and great was their joy at finding him at last. They all made a little camp for themselves, and while they are sitting there, talking, we'll go back to Snugglepot and Ragged Blossom.
"How did you know where to find her,
Frilly?" asked Snugglepot.
"That's a secret," said Frilly. "Do not ask me. I dare not tell you." "But what was that terrible giant doing there?"
asked Ragged Blossom.
"Shh," said Frilly. "I may not tell you any of these things."
"Oh," said Ragged Blossom, holding Abelia close to her.
"Perhaps he is a wicked spirit, and has held her all these years."
"Perhaps," said Frilly. "And maybe he's dead now. The sperm whale is a strong giant." When at last they reached home, they found Anchovy in tears and great distress.
"Oh, my dear nuts," she said, "I thought you were lost."
Then Ragged Blossom held up the baby. At the sight of it, Anne lifted her hands in joy and amazement, and soon trumpeters were sent forth to spread the news, and great was the joy of the fish folk. Now it chanced that John Dory was away upon a journey, so the children were relieved, and a great merrymaking went on in the fish folk town. Flags were hung, and bands played, and everyone was glad. All the fish folk children had holidays, and the sea urchins went wild. Ragged Blossom and Snugglepot joined in the sports, playing trammel net and riding races upon flying fish, a sport much loved by the fish folk. How wonderful! If any of you have seen flying fish in the flesh, or even on a documentary, you will know how beautiful they are, and what a wonderful thing it is to see. I can only imagine what it would be like to ride one. Each day they went driving in Anne's carriage, which we can see here with the beautiful leafy sea dragons pulling it along. How marvelous. Ragged Blossom always carried Abelia, for everyone must know that she belonged to Ragged Blossom. After many days of happiness, a shadow fell upon the town. John Dory returned. He looked pale and tired, and went about angry and silent. Like magic, the merrymaking ceased. Everyone spoke in whispers and wondered what would happen next. One day, Anne came to Ragged Blossom, greatly distressed. "Dear little Ragged Blossom," she said, "you and Snugglepot must leave me. Go at once, or I fear some great harm may befall you." As she said this, Anne wept and clasped her hands in sorrow. "Oh, Anne," said Ragged Blossom, weeping too, "where shall we go?" "Anywhere, anywhere, only go quickly and hide, and send Frilly secretly to tell me how you are from time to time." "But, oh, what about baby Abelia?" said Ragged Blossom. "I will care for her," said Anne. "Oh, I could not leave her," answered Ragged Blossom. So it came about that Ragged Blossom and Snugglepot rode out from Fishfolk Town and left their dear Anne, taking with them little Abelia and the faithful Frilly. When they had travelled a far way, they rested in a small village, where they made for themselves a little home. The fish folk round about were kind to them, and they lived contentedly. Snugglepot and Frilly hunting for food, while Ragged Blossom kept house and cared for Abelia. After a while, luck came to them. On one of his rambles, Frilly found a large hook baited with beautiful meat. It hung in a clean, sandy spot, and always in the same place. "Let's open a butcher shop," said Snugglepot, when Frilly told him of his find. "Splendid," said Frilly. "We shall make a lot of money." So they moved their little house to the spot and built a shop. It was splendid. As fast as they cut off the meat, the hook was hauled up and let down again, always in the same spot. They made lots of money from the rich fish folk, but when any poor souls or old fishwives came, they gave them meat for nothing. But alas, one day the hook went up and didn't come down again. "What shall we do now?" they all said in dismay. "I know," said Ragged Blossom. "We'll start a laundry. Baby needs so many things, and we can wash them all at the same time." Snugglepot and Frilly agreed, so they moved house again and started business. One day, while Ragged Blossom was scraping a large coat, she turned the pockets, and out fell a note. It was large writing, and to her great surprise, she saw her own name on it. Picking it up, she read it all. This is what it said. "Dear Octopus, 1,000,000 pearls, all of Coral Point, and half the Bay of Clams shall be yours if you find me the baby Abelia and the 2 nuts called Ragged Blossom and Snugglepot. Your faithful fishfolk, John Dory. When Ragged Blossom read this, her little heart nearly stopped beating. Who was Octopus? What should they do? Hardly had she time to think before she saw Snugglepot and Frilly hastening towards her. Great news! Called Snugglepot, waving something. What do you think it was? A gum leaf. Look, said Snugglepot, breathlessly. We found it. The hook was hanging in its old place, and on it was this letter. Hear what it says. I'm up here. Cling to the hook, and I will pull you up. Your friend, Cuddlepie. Oh, said Ragged Blossom in amazement. Oh, Cuddlepie, dear, dear Cuddlepie, I am glad. Then she remembered the letter she had found. But see, she exclaimed, look what I found in that coat. Great starfish, exclaimed Frilly. Old octopus. He is a friend of the giant squid. He lives in the Bay of Clams. He is terribly fierce. We must go at once, said Snugglepot. There's not a moment to lose, said Frilly, and even as he spoke, they heard a great commotion in the village. It's John Dory, exclaimed Frilly. Oh, hurry, he cried. Snugglepot caught Ragged Blossom's hand, and they ran, half swimming, to the door. But it was too late. There stood the terrible John Dory, but the doorway was small, and he stuck halfway. Quick! Gasped Frilly, pushing Snugglepot and Ragged Blossom back. The outer door! But there was someone there. The window! Shouted Frilly, and he lifted up Ragged Blossom and tumbled her through. Then he pushed Snugglepot up, but just as he was getting him through, John Dory rushed round the house and caught him. Frilly darted out of the door behind John Dory, and fastening his teeth into the back of his neck, he bit furiously. Where is Ragged Blossom? Growled John Dory, shaking Snugglepot fiercely. I won't tell, said Snugglepot, kicking with all his might, while Frilly kept on biting, and John Dory could not reach him to knock him off. Find me Ragged Blossom, or I'll bite your head off, shouted John Dory. I won't, said Snugglepot, kicking again. Then here it goes, said John Dory, choking with rage, and with that he opened his huge jaws and put Snugglepot's head right into his mouth. Stop! Screamed a voice, so sharply that John Dory looked round to see where it came from. It was Anne. Her great dragons came galloping almost on top of them. Anne sprang from the carriage, rushed to John Dory, and pulled Snugglepot from him. Then she fell fainting to the ground, with Snugglepot clasped in her arms. John Dory, who though he was so greedy and so cruel, really loved Anne, was quite grieved to see her lying there so white, and he said gently, Anne, dear little Anne, look up. But Anne lay quite still, and her eyes were shut, and her arms hung limp beside her. Then John Dory felt real distress. Oh, speak to me, Anne, he said, his big, hard face growing gentle, while his hands trembled with fear. Oh, Anne, tell me, where are you hurt? Then Anne's big eyes slowly opened and looked at him. Here I am hurt, John, she said, putting her hand to her heart. But what? What hurts you there? asked John. You, John, said Anne, looking at him. You are so greedy, so cruel, so fierce, that you terrify me. I dry. And her eyes closed again, her head fell back, and she lay dead. At these signs, John fell upon his knees beside her, clasped her hands, imploring her, "Come back, Anne, stay with me. I will never be fierce again, never greedy, never cruel, never shall I terrify you. Gentle and kind will I be to you, Anne, and to all creatures in the sea. I swear by the fins of Neptune." Now, when Anne heard these words, she opened her eyes, and seeing the truth in John's face that he meant what he said, she put her arms about his neck and smiled upon him. And all the fish folk in the sea can tell you, from that day to this, John Dory was a changed creature. Though it must be written, he is the only one of his family that has ever been known to do so. Snugglepot and Frilly had remained struck with wonder by all they saw, and when Anne rose and asked where Ragged Blossom was, they seemed to wake from a dream. But Ragged Blossom, who had been hiding nearby, came running to Anne and threw her arms about her. "Oh, Anne," she sobbed, "we have to leave you forever, and we're going back to the bush. Our dear friend Cuddlepie has sent a message." Then John turned away to hide his gladness, for he could not bear that Anne should love these nuts. "But where is little Abelia?" asked Anne. "She's sleeping," answered Ragged Blossom, as she lifted the lid of a shell, and there lay the tiny baby, fast asleep. "Then I shall keep her for you," said Anne, "and love her and care for her, just as you would have." "But," exclaimed Ragged Blossom, "I shall take her with me." "Up to the land?" cried Anne and Frilly together. "She will dry," they said with horror. "Dry?" gasped Ragged Blossom. "Most surely," said Anne. "Oh, yes, surely," said Frilly. "Oh, Snugglepot," cried Ragged Blossom, "let us stay here." "I can't," said Snugglepot. "I must go to Cuddlepie. He's my brother. I must go." "Oh me, cried Ragged Blossom. "I will come, but let us go quickly, or my heart will break." So they all went to the place where the great hook was. There it hung, throwing a great shadow over the clean sand. In silence, they kissed Anne and shook hands with John, and hugged Frilly, and kissed the baby sleeping in Anne's arms. Then they both put up their hands to take hold of the great hook. Ragged Blossom looked back at little Abelia, and as she did so, little Abelia opened her eyes, and looking at Ragged Blossom held out her arms to her. "Oh," cried Ragged Blossom, jumping down, "I cannot go, I cannot go." And running to the baby, she caught it from Anne and held it fast. "Goodbye, dear Snugglepot," she sobbed. "Goodbye, goodbye." Then the big hook began to move up slowly, It lifted higher and higher, far up over their heads, and Snugglepot rose with it, growing smaller and smaller, till at last he faded out of sight. It was a long way to the top of the sea, but Snugglepot clung to the hook, and when at last he came swinging out into the sunshine, it so dazzled his eyes that he couldn't see. The air was so light after the water that he felt quite giddy. And what with sorrow at leaving Ragged Blossom and joy of going back to Cuddlepie, poor Snugglepot felt strange and weak, and would have fallen back into the sea if two big, strong hands had not caught him.
"Is that you, Cuddlepie?"
called Snugglepot, for he still couldn't see. Laughed a great rough voice. So, you thought I was Cuddlepie, did you? That's a good joke, that is. Snugglepot shivered. He knew that voice. It was the captain, the Bad Banksia.
"Cuddlepie!"
called Snugglepot.
"Cuddlepie, help! Help, help! Cuddlepie!"
He shouted with all his might, and someone heard him. A long way off, on a post, sat a shag that had been posted there by Mr. Shag. He knew the name, and at first the faint sound of it, he sent it along to the shag on the next post, who passed it along, and so it travelled from post to post.
"Cuddlepie!"
they screamed. Each shag took up the cry, and it passed along from post to post quicker than I can tell you. That is why we talk of sending things by post. In a very short time, only a snap of the fingers, before the Bad Banksia had stopped laughing, Mr. Shag had the news. He told Mrs. Kookaburra. She flew off to tell Mr. Eagle. Mr. Eagle found Mr. Lizard, and Mr. Lizard told Cuddlepie. Such was the excitement and eagerness among the friends that at first they all rushed about, getting in each other's way and doing nothing. But Mr. Lizard soon found his head. "Mr. Eagle," he said, "you carry Cuddlepie to the spot and keep your eye open for the enemy on land. Mrs. Kookaburra, you get a bed ready in case anyone's hurt. Mr. Shag, you go along to the shore and give us the signal from the sea." And with that, Mr. Lizard dashed away through the bush. Cuddlepie jumped upon Mr. Eagle's back, his bag of stones across his shoulders, his sling in hand. Straight and swift flew Mr. Eagle, high into the sky. Mr. Shag went low over the water, and Mrs. Kookaburra skimmed the treetops. Everyone kept an eye on Mr. Shag. Presently he rose, then dropped like a stone into the water. It was the signal. Down swooped Mr. Eagle, a huge stone clutched in his wonderful claws. As they came down, they looked below, and here they saw a terrible thing. All the Bad Banksia men were sitting in their boats, laughing and clapping their hands and looking up at a high cliff. There, on top of the cliff, stood the baddest of all the Bad Banksia men. In one hand he held poor little Snugglepot, and in the other a great stone. At his feet was a deep, deep hole. "Now," he shouted to the other Banksia men, "here he goes. This is the end of him." Then he held Snugglepot over the hole and was just going to drop him when, with a terrible shout, out sprang Mr. Lizard, right upon the Bad Banksia man. Snugglepot fell from his grasp and rolled away right to the edge of the cliff. But a dear little plant that was growing there stiffened and held him from falling, even though it suffered in doing so, for plants are kind to the nuts. Then began a great struggle. First, Mr. Lizard was uppermost. Then the wicked Banksia was on top. Sometimes they rolled about, sometimes they rose upon their feet again, and all the time they drew nearer and nearer the edge of the cliff. Mr. Eagle swooped down. Plop! He let the great stone fall, and down went one boatload of Banksia men. Then Cuddlepie took aim with his sling, and bzzz! A sharp stone caught the Bad Banksia man in the back, but he only held poor Mr. Lizard the tighter. Mr. Lizard was fast losing his breath.
"In another moment he'll be over,"
shouted Cuddlepie, as Mr. Eagle rose with another big stone. Plump went the stone, and down went another boat full of Banksias. Bzzz! Went a stone from Cuddlepie's sling, and this time it hit the Bad Banksia man on the head. Over he went, his fingers loosened from Mr. Lizard's throat, and just as both were toppling into the sea, Mr. Eagle swooped down and caught Mr. Lizard. Splash! Went the Banksia man, down, down into the sea, and never a Banksia man was left to tell the tale.
"Snugglepot! Snugglepot!"
called Cuddlepie, jumping from Mr. Eagle and running to his side. But Snugglepot lay still. And here we can see that terrible confrontation with Mr. Lizard grappling the Bad Banksia man, and poor Snugglepot at the edge of the cliff, saved by that nice little plant. Very gently they carried him to the bed prepared by Mrs. Kookaburra, and then they all sat round, Mr. Lizard panting and bruised, Mr. Shag all dripping with sea, Mr. Eagle and Mrs. Kookaburra all watching to see if his eyes would open. And they did. "Cuddlepie!" he cried, springing up. "Snugglepot!" cried Cuddlepie, hugging him tightly. "Where's the Banksia man?" asked Cuddlepot. "Deady bones," said Cuddlepie. "Good root," said Snugglepot. And he fell asleep again, and slept, for he was worn out. When at last he woke and told them how Ragged Blossom had stayed behind to take care of little Abelia, Cuddlepie wept sorely, for he missed his little friend. "Don't cry," said Snugglepot. "She'll be quite happy with the fish folk and dear Anne and Frilly, and by we may be able to go down and see them all." So Cuddlepie cheered up, and they said good-bye to Mr. Shag and Mrs. Kookaburra and Mr. Eagle. Mr. Lizard, being rested, made a bed and slung it upon his back, and in that way he carried Snugglepot beside Cuddlepie all the long, long journey, away, away back to their old home. And great was the rejoicing when the dear mother and father once more clasped their little nuts to their hearts. And this is the end of the second book of the tales of Snugglepot and Cuddlepie. But as you can see, it is not the end of this volume. When next we meet on Soft Stories, we will begin the third volume in the saga of Snugglepot and Cuddlepie, entitled Little Abelia. I hope you'll join me, and that you have enjoyed this traipse through the bush and under the sea, with Snugglepot, Cuddlepie, Ragged Blossom, and friends. I hope to see you soon, but until next we meet, I will say goodbye and wish you all the best. Goodbye.